ever since Lessing in his renowned essay Laocoon defined the disputed boundaries between poetry and art, the result, unanimously accepted by all aestheticians, has been to consider that the difference between them is that art lies in the qualification of space, poetry in that of time; that art expresses repose, poetry movement. In order, therefore, for a subject to lend itself to artistic representation, it must have a quiet transparency, so that its inner essence rests in a corresponding outer form. The less this is true of a subject, the more difficult becomes the artist's task, until at last the difference asserts itself, and warns him that there is simply nothing he can do. If we apply the principle here casually suggested, but not expounded, to the relation between grief and joy, we shall readily see that joy is far more easily represented artistically than grief. It should by no means be denied that grief can be artistically represented, but it should be said that there is a stage in its evolution when it becomes essential to establish a contrast between the inner and the outer, which makes its representation impossible for art. This evolution is rooted in the very nature of grief. It is the essence of joy to reveal itself, while grief tries to hide, sometimes even to deceive. Joy is communicative, social, open-hearted, and desires expression. Grief is secretive, silent, solitary, and seeks to retire into itself. The truth of this remark will surely not be denied by anyone who has even a moderate acquaintance with life. There are men so constituted that under the stress of emotion the blood rushes to the surface, making the inner emotion outwardly visible. Others are so constituted that the blood flows backward, seeking the inner parts and the chambers of the heart. A somewhat similar relation exists as to the mode of expression between joy and grief. The first type described is much easier to observe than the latter. In the first you see the expression, the inner feeling is outwardly visible. In the case of the second, you suspect the inner emotion. The outward pallor is, as it were, the parting salutation of the inner excitement, and imagination and thought hasten after the fugitive emotion to where it conceals itself in its secret hiding place. Especially is this true of the type of grief I propose to consider, that which we may call reflective grief. In reflective grief the external contains at most a hint which may furnish a clue, sometimes not even that much. This type does not lend itself to artistic representation, for the equilibrium between the inner and the outer has been destroyed, and thus the emotion is not spatially determinable. Also, in another respect, this grief resists artistic representation, since it lacks inner repose, and is constantly in movement. Although this motion does not enrich it with any new content, yet the agitation is nevertheless essential. It revolves within itself, like a squirrel in its cage, although not so monotonously, since it is constantly alternating between the different combinations of sorrow's internal factors. What prevents reflective grief from being artistically portrayed is that it lacks repose, that it never comes into harmony with itself, or rests in any single definitive expression. As a sick man throws himself about in his pain, now on one side and then on the other, so is reflective grief tossed about in the effort to find its object and its expression. Whenever grief finds repose, then will its inner essence gradually work its way out, become visible externally, and thus also subject to artistic representation. As soon as it finds rest and peace within itself, this movement from within outwardly invariably sets in. The reflective grief moves in the opposite direction, like blood retreating from the surface of the body, leaving only a hint of its presence in the sudden paleness. Reflective grief is not accompanied by any characteristic outward change. Even at its very inception it hastens inward, and only a watchful observer suspects its vanishing. Afterwards, it keeps careful guard over its outward appearance, so as to make it as unobtrusive as possible. Retiring thus within, it finds at last an enclosure, an innermost recess, where it hopes it can remain. And now begins its monotonous movement. Back and forth it swings, like a pendulum, and cannot come to rest. Ever it begins afresh from the beginning, and reconsiders everything. It rehearses the witnesses, it collates and verifies their testimony, as it has done 100 times before. But the task is never finished. Monotony exercises in the course of time a benumbing influence upon the mind, like the monotonous sound of water dripping from the roof, like the monotonous whir of a spinning wheel, like the monotonous sound of a man walking with measured tread back and forth on the floor above. So this movement of reflective grief finally gives to it a certain sense of numb relief, becoming a necessity as affording it an illusion of progress. Finally, an equilibrium is established, and the need for obtaining for itself an outward expression, in so far as this need may have once or twice asserted itself, now ceases. Outwardly, everything is quiet and calm, and far within, in its little secret recess, grief dwells like a prisoner strictly guarded in a subterranean dungeon, who spends year after year in monotonously moving back and forth within his little enclosure, never weary of traversing sorrow's longer or shorter path. Soren Kierkegaard, From Either Or, Part 1, pages 167 to 169. Translated by David F and Lillian Marvin Swenson, 1944, 1959, 1971. Princeton University Press.